Hello, I'm Fred Rosenbaum, scholar in residence for the East Bay International Jewish Film Festival. And I wanted to speak to you now on the film Berenshtein. So Leonard Berenshtein was one of about 30,000 Jewish partisans operating mostly from the forests of East Central Europe. And they fought back against the Nazis. Their objective was to disrupt the flow of men and materials to the Eastern Front, where the Wehrmacht and the Red Army were locked in a titanic struggle. Primarily, this meant using high explosives to derail German trains. But they did a lot more. They attacked Wehrmacht outposts, military convoys, and supply centers, disrupted enemy communication, punished collaborators, and gathered intelligence for the British and the Soviets. Partisans obtained their own weapons. They built their own bases. They fought in what turned out to be the two coldest winters of the century. They fought with a meager supply of food against a far larger, better equipped, better trained army. And they not only accomplished their military goals, but also protected thousands of civilians at the same time, including the elderly and children. The Bielski brothers, for instance, maintained a family camp of 1,200 Jews. Berenshtein's brigade did not shelter non-combatants. It needed to move on a moment's notice, but he and his men liberated a concentration camp. Now, we usually think of rescuers as non-Jews. They're often called righteous Gentiles, and they were. But this is a story about a Jew who led a rescue of Jews. And that's just one of his many daring actions. Yet when armed Jewish resistance is considered by scholars and the public alike, it is invariably the Warsaw Ghetto uprising of April 1943 that draws the most attention. Each year, Yom HaShoah is held on the anniversary of that awe-inspiring revolt, a month-long head-to-head battle against the SS. The heroism of those hundreds of young Jewish men and women, the large majority of whom gave their lives, is unquestionable. But the Jewish partisans, 40 times as numerous, who fought for over 2 years and inflicted far more harm on the Germans, they're even more important than the Warsaw Ghetto fighters in the annals of the Shoah. Thankfully, 2 out of every 3 Jewish partisans survived. Then most of them made Aliyah, and while they have been honored in Israel, only in the past 2 decades have the Jewish partisans received the recognition they deserve in the United States. Right here in the Bay Area, former partisans and their children set up the Jewish Partisan Educational Foundation in 2000, which has made an international impact with its outstanding curricula, videos, and survivor testimonies. I've made a modest contribution to the field myself by co-authoring the memoirs of 3 Jewish partisans. One of them just celebrated her 100th birthday, and she can still sing the rousing Yiddish partisan hymn that she learned in the forest in 1943. The greatest song to come out of the Holocaust. Now, some partisan brigades were made up exclusively of Jews. The best example is that of the Bielskis, whom I just mentioned, and their story is vividly told in the popular film Defiance. Mostly accurate historically, although I wish Daniel Craig, who played Tuvia Bielski, looked a little more Jewish. However, the overwhelming majority of Jewish partisans served in the Soviet brigades, which were highly diverse. This was the case of my three subjects and also of Berenshtein. His story was well researched by the filmmakers, who also interviewed dozens of other former partisans. It convincingly depicts the harsh, threatening life in the forest. But Berenstein's experience was unusual, even unique. Just the way he relates his testimony is out of the ordinary. He is slowly dying before our eyes. In a small, humble apartment in a remote town of northern Israel. Although he was confined to a wheelchair, his building had no elevator. He would pass away in 2019 at the age of 98 during the making of the film, and we view his burial. He had a hard life in old age with a devoted, loving caregiver, but seemingly without family and friends, without adequate health and disability benefits, and without proper recognition for his extraordinary wartime service. This was a major reason the Israeli filmmakers undertook this project. Now, can we see image number one? The director, Roman Shumanov, and screenwriter Simon Schechter are themselves immigrants from the former Soviet Union, along with the film's producer, Schechter's brother. And they share Berenstein's alienation in a strange new country, as Shumanov recently said in an interview. Both of his grandfathers served in the Red Army during the war. He feels that the partisans who have been honored in Israel, like the famed poet Abba Kovner, the subject of another movie in this festival called Plan A, feels these partisans had a particular profile. They escaped to the forest from the Jewish ghettos, and after they fought back against the Nazis, came to Palestine as early as they could, served in the War of Independence, and thus were lionized in the new state as Jewish heroes. Berenshtein was different. And can we see the next slide, please? Berenshtein was a Jewish partisan who was devoted to the Soviet Union until it disintegrated. And I think in this picture from his expression, you can see a mix of pride, but also defiance. Yes, he too made Aliyah, but only in 1993 when he was well into his 70s, and only after the collapse of the USSR. He was among the very few Jews who remained in anti-Semitic Kyiv after the war, which was an integral part of the Soviet Union. He did not even move to Moscow or Leningrad, which had many more Jews. Kyiv had only one partially functioning synagogue and not even one rabbi after 1960. Later, in the 1980s, he did not immigrate to Israel or the United States, as did hundreds of thousands of other Soviet Jews, the refuseniks, but rather continued to live in the capital of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic until it gained its independence and was thus no longer part of his beloved USSR. If alive today, he would no doubt want Ukraine to rejoin Russia. In the Great Patriotic War, as it's commemorated to this day, he showed unswerving loyalty to his country, to Stalin, to the Communist Party. Okay, we can remove that. Thank you. Now, most of the Jewish partisans joined a Soviet partisan brigade, as I said, but they usually did not have any great love for a country that was a totalitarian dictatorship that had all but crushed Jewish cultural and religious life, and which sent hundreds of thousands of Jews to the Gulag. To them, the USSR was the lesser of two evils. After their brigades disbanded and the war still raged, most Jewish partisans avoided conscription into the Red Army any way they could. They dodged the draft. Not Berenshtein, a diehard Soviet warrior. He was a lieutenant in the Red Army, and after his division was shattered, he joined a partisan brigade. Later, he served all the way to VE Day. Now, let's look at the map of the military operations. If you could put that up, image 3. This film opens with a horrific battle of Kyiv, which you can see on this map. It's part of the German invasion of 4 million soldiers across a 1,500-mile-long front. This is usually considered the largest and most ferocious military operation of all time. Within months, the Wehrmacht took over territory about twice the size of Texas, and it was nearing the gates of Moscow. If you look at this map, the dotted blue line shows the extent of that German invasion. Thank you. Now, near Kyiv, you see the areas of fighting are in red, and of course, Kyiv is indicated that way. Near Kyiv, the Red Army suffered the largest enemy encirclement in military history. Astonishingly, in this battle alone, the Soviets lost 600,000 men, either killed, captured, or missing. Okay, you can remove that map. Thank you. Now, that catastrophe and others, that summer and fall, left many hundreds of thousands of dazed and disoriented Soviet soldiers behind enemy lines, including those like Berenshtein, who went into hiding. Many still had their weapons. There were also Red Army deserters in the region, as well as escapees from the indescribably brutal German POW camps. These former Red Army men constituted the large majority of the roughly 250,000 Soviet partisans in Eastern Europe. Now, Berenshtein in particular was a great asset for his partisan unit, an artillery officer who had graduated from a military school in Kyiv in the late 1930s and joined the army even before the war. Most of the Jewish partisans, although young and strong, having grown up close to the land, had no formal military experience. They had fled ahead of the SS Einsatzgruppen, who followed on the heels of the rapid Wehrmacht advance, and who murdered over 1 million Jews in 1 year. Now let's look at the next image of Berenshtein in the partisans. Berenshtein, rightly concerned about the anti-Semitism that was rife in his brigade, hid his Jewish identity, although he did inform his commander. The typical Soviet partisan brigade was about 10 to 15% Jewish. The film does not make clear whether there were any other Jews in his unit, either covering up their identity or not. Yet very few Jewish partisans chose to pass as Gentile, or even could. Yes, Berenshtein was highly acculturated, having lived in large cosmopolitan Kyiv and having attended military school there, but he had been born and raised in a small, remote shtetl, 250 miles away, until the age of 15. And his grandfather was a rabbi. Even if his facial features did not give him away, and we can see that from this photo, that's certainly possible, he had to erase any trace of a Yiddish accent or Jewish mannerisms. One Jewish partisan, also from Ukraine, told me how hard it was to disguise yourself as a Christian. They could instinctively tell I was Jewish, he said. They could smell it on me. I don't think the actor playing the young Berenshtein could have passed. The pattern I found among Jewish partisans was not to keep their identity a secret, but rather to proudly show it. Okay, can remove that. Proudly show it and often volunteer for dangerous missions to counter the stereotype of the faint-hearted and easily frightened Jew. They also put themselves in peril more readily than the others, because Jews, having lost so many family members, had more of a score to settle and, in a sense, less to lose. Now, as you see in the film, partisan life was inseparable from the forest, the only place to offer protection. Its dense trees provided concealment. Its swamps and bogs hindered German search parties. Its rural villages and farms were sources of food. So the woods, changing dramatically with the seasons, are almost a character in this movie. But of course, the forest could also be treacherous, and day-to-day living required much resilience and resourcefulness. As it turned out, most of the partisans, Jews and non-Jews, were used to manual labor and the great outdoors. The status that people had in their pre-war lives was now reversed. A working class man or woman who could ride a horse, shoot a rifle, carry heavy equipment in the snow, who could withstand the cold and subsist on a bad diet, that person was a valuable member of the team. Someone who had been a lawyer, say, or a Talmud scholar, or a historian, was usually not suited for fighting in the forest. Nor were the professionals and intellectuals comfortable in a culture of heavy drinking, coarse language, and violent behavior. As one of my co-authors told me, There was no place for mama's boys in the partisans. Now, the film does not show how they sheltered themselves. Their solution was simple and ingenious. With lots of timber around, they built semi-underground bunkers, about 3 feet underground and 3 feet above ground, almost like a log cabin embedded in the earth. Tree branches were put on top for camouflage and insulation. These bunkers were built long and narrow, so 30 people slept in each one in 2 rows of 15 each, with people close together for warmth and no thought to gender. There was a small stove for heating, which they vented with tin cans. For food, they went out to the villages and brought back livestock, canned goods, and beans, often taken from the peasants at gunpoint. And you see such expeditions in the movie. If the farmhouse was unoccupied and they had to break in, they left a kind of receipt so the peasants would know they hadn't been robbed by common thieves, but were rather supporting a vital cause. On these food foraging missions, they also searched for guns, such as hunting rifles. These weapons enabled the partisans to commandeer ever larger supplies of food to feed themselves and the civilian camp if they had one. But the diet, especially in winter, was largely meat, with only paltry amounts of fruit and vegetables. So scurvy became widespread, as well as other diseases. There were many doctors in the partisans, but a lack of medicine and medical equipment. And we see that Commander stressed that in his speech to potential recruits. One plague, although not shown in the film, but cited in almost every memoir, was that of lice, because the partisans slept often unwashed with their clothes and boots on. Nothing worked against these tiny, relentless insects, but all sorts of remedies were tried. One was to cover yourself with a foul-smelling tar, but that too was usually ineffective. One of my co-authors met her future husband on guard duty, both carrying rifles and both covered in black tar. Not a very romantic first date, but it led to a lifelong marriage. There were many women in the partisans, not only in the civilian camp where they cooked and washed and mended clothes for the combatants, but also in the fighters' camp. And like the men, they went out on perilous missions. At night, it was not unusual for people to pair off and be intimate with one another. But the females often felt endangered, like the very young redhead Marina in the film, who suddenly pulls out a knife to ward off a man who makes crude sexual advances. He would later rape a civilian and be executed for it. Although at times she appears almost childlike, she can defend herself. But many other women felt they had to adopt a different strategy. If they took one partisan as a steady boyfriend, especially if he was physically strong or in the commander's inner circle. They would be protected against all others. Often educated young Jewish women from middle-class religious families ended up not only with non-Jews, but with men who had been menial laborers before the war, the kind of people that in conventional society, outside the forest, they would have had nothing to do with. Interestingly, many of these seemingly unsuitable liaisons survived for decades. After the war, perhaps this could be explained by the intense partisan experience that bound the forest wife to her man as nothing else could. Berenshtein met his future wife in the partisans, the wireless operator Shura, who parachutes into enemy territory along with him. We see her sitting beside him and expressing her love through Russian poetry and song, verses that also extol the beauty of nature. Many partisan memoirs include this kind of tenderness and passion between two young people. Despite the harrowing daily struggle for survival, or maybe because of it. I mentioned the couple covered with tar, who both began a lifelong union. Another of my co-authors, at age 17, met the love of her life in the partisans, a dreamy young man who played the guitar. But he was killed on a mission. Until her death at 93, she cherished the poetic love letters that he wrote her when he had to be away from camp. They are published in English translation in the memoir we wrote together. They were originally written in pencil, and years later, to prevent the words from fading, she went over the script with her own pen. Now, as you've no doubt gathered, a partisan brigade was not run in a democratic way. The commander had to be a charismatic figure whose rule would be unquestioned, almost like a warlord. Berenshtein was in charge of 100 fighters, the size of most partisan battalions, 10 of which constituted a full brigade. He was only in his early 20s, but his high rank was not unusual because sometimes even the youngest men, through their courage, their skill, and the force of their personalities, could instill obedience and respect in their older comrades. He also had a great deal of self-discipline. His moral compass remained largely intact. But many of the commanders, perhaps most of them, had hot tempers and drank heavily and felt entitled to sleep with any woman in the camp. The battalion commander, the brigade leader over him, and the commissar sent from Moscow over him, they often imposed their will by force. We see Berenshtein order the execution of 4 of his own men. The infraction was the rape of a civilian woman and the silence of the perpetrator's 3 comrades during the crime. I came across numerous examples of such summary executions of partisans, but usually for misdeeds in a different category, such as falling asleep during guard duty, going AWOL or refusing to obey an order while in combat. The principled Berenshtein was one commander who expanded the list of capital crimes to include terrorizing innocent peasants. Now, even beyond the supremacy of the commander, there was a rigid hierarchy among the fighters. The most privileged were the dynamiters, those who laid the explosives that could derail a train or blow up a German vehicle. Nothing was denied them in terms of food, vodka, or women. Some of these demolition men became legendary, and Berenshtein was one of them. There are documented cases of him wrecking 8 enemy trains on his own and 42 trains working with others. I know it sounds odd, but there's a kind of partisan dynamiters Hall of Fame. And Berenshtein is 13th on the list, covering all of Europe. Okay, let's see the next slide, please. Here we can see the dynamiters at work. Now, at first, before they had the explosives, they could shift the rails with a crowbar. Later, when they received the mines from the Red Army through parachute drops, they could plant them on the tracks, as you see in the film, or they sneaked them into train stations and slapped them on the wheels of the train before it departed. Then the Wehrmacht began putting sentries along the railway lines. So the partisans would sneak up and kill these guards using a gun with a silencer. Sometimes the Germans would put boxcars filled with rocks in front of the locomotive, which pushed them along. So if the train went over a mine, little damage would be done. So then the partisans would go to a manual detonator with a long fuse, wait for the decoy cars to pass, and then just at the right moment, trigger the blast. It was a game of cat and mouse, won by the partisans usually. Let's look at the next slide. That's it. From 1942 to 1944, damage was done to thousands of Wehrmacht trains. The partisans seriously interfered with the Germans' attempt to reinforce their flagging armies at Stalingrad in particular, the most pivotal of all the massive battles on the Eastern Front. The Nazis finally abandoned the railways as unsafe and shifted to the highways. Of course, the partisans mined those as well and left craters across entire roadways. Okay, you can remove that, thank you. Usually, the partisan military tactic was hit and run. They might wait for the Germans to come to repair the train wreck or the roadbed, and then launch a second attack on the maintenance crew. But usually, they would not engage the Wehrmacht in head-to-head combat. The idea was to be cautious with the safety of the fighters, who sometimes were also protectors of civilian camps. Recall the way Berenshtein chooses not to risk his scouting patrol when they come across a massacre of a Ukrainian village by a large and heavily armed German platoon. Marina instinctively tries to save the victims, but he pulls her back. Yet sometimes he does take great risks for others. We see this toward the end of the film when Berenshtein's unit frees the inmates of the slave labor camp in Pushkov, who had been forced to work constructing the V2 missile testing site about 10 miles away. It was a relatively small camp, but it stood out for its terror even within the vast Nazi network of death. Although it held mostly Poles, about 7,000 Jews died there due to the horrendous conditions. Only a few hundred Jews and others remained alive by the time Berenshtein arrived in August 1944. The official records, by the way, simply credit the Red Army for liberating the camp, not the partisans. But while rescue and, of course, military objectives were paramount, there was revenge too. This was called capturing a tongue. That is to say, they rooted out informers, capturing a tongue. And then they punished them mercilessly, sometimes savagely. These were mostly peasants who had betrayed Jews in hiding or reported on the partisans' movements, just to receive a reward of food, liquor, or clothing from the Germans, sometimes just to receive a sack of salt. It's not uncommon for a few partisans to ride out to a farmhouse and torture and then execute such an informer. Berenshtein, as you saw, had no regrets about this at all, seeing it as part and parcel of the absolutely hellish environment of total war in Eastern Europe. One former Jewish partisan whom I interviewed for his memoir, the sole survivor of a family of 7, described to me what occurred after he and his comrades captured the collaborator. He said, "We made a fire and then burned him alive." Let's look at image number 6. Here's what Joseph Pell said. "What we did seemed like the most natural thing in the world, and none of us had any qualms about it." You see on the left, there is Yossel Eppelbaum, as he was known, in the partisans, age 18 to 20. And there is Joe Pell on the right, a very successful real estate developer in the Bay Area, who passed away at the end of 2020 at the age of 96. Now, to continue, he says, "To me, it was like butchering a cow when I worked in the slaughterhouse. But that person was worse than an animal. And the punishment we meted out was no crueler than the deaths he caused our people. And they had been completely innocent. I felt no emotion while we watched him die. If I thought of anything, it was the gruesome killings of my father and brothers the year before, also caused by an informer." And then I think the second part is very telling. "One can argue that the collaborators we executed should have been given fair trials. In an ideal world, maybe so. But where was the court to try them? Where was the prison to hold them?" Okay, thank you. Oh, there is a picture of me working with Joe Pell on his memoir. We just spoke about a very gruesome part of it, but there were many lighthearted moments as well. And I miss him very much. Okay. On another occasion, Joe Pell firebombed the home of the informer who had betrayed his own family to the SS. I asked him, Joe, do you want me to put these stories in the book? He gave me a semi-frown, as if to say, if you think I'm ashamed of it, you're way off base. Of course, this unsparing treatment was also meted out to any German soldier that they captured. Now, some Jewish partisans, especially Jewish women, refused to participate in the killing or torturing of a person in captivity. They thought that such a grisly act of vengeance would bring them down to the level of the Nazis themselves. Who among us can say with certainty what he or she would do in such extreme situations? We should also keep in mind that such cold-blooded punishment of collaborators wasn't solely revenge. There was also a tactical consideration. They wanted the peasants to feel for their lives if they betrayed Jews. And largely this strategy worked. The number of enemy informers gradually decreased, and the partisans strengthened their hold on the countryside. After a while, certain areas became almost sovereign territories, islands of freedom, even in Nazi-occupied Europe. There were sort of forest republics, and the outlying villages paid tribute to them. Late in the war, the military role of the partisans shifted. In some battles, the partisans fought alongside Soviet troops, no longer a ragged guerrilla force, but rather like well-trained soldiers, a level unthinkable 2 years earlier. Toward the end of the film, you see Berenshtein's battalion wearing regulation Red Army uniforms. Once the Soviets launched their mammoth counteroffensive, the partisans were a factor in the liberation of several cities, including Kyiv, and that too is shown in the film. Many had literally crawled into the forest on their hands and knees, and they came out very much standing on their own 2 feet. They differ from most other Holocaust survivors in that they were not liberated by Allied troops. As soon as they joined the partisans, they liberated themselves, even if they remained on enemy territory. Now, I do feel I need to correct one thing in this otherwise highly credible film. The importance of the mission to locate the V2 missiles is exaggerated, and Berenshtein's role in deterring their use is overstated. The official website for the movie describes him as, quote, the man who located and destroyed the facility where Hitler had developed his doomsday weapon. Breathless accounts of reviewers are in the same vein. Here's one. Berenshtein must stop the Germans from developing a weapon of mass destruction that could potentially change the course of the war. He will defeat Hitler and destroy his new toy. Well, that's not the case. The V2 was a first step toward space exploration, but actually had little military value. It was the world's first ballistic missile, going 50 miles up in the air and touching outer space. I don't mean to say it wasn't terrifying. It came down by the force of gravity at a speed of 1,800 miles per hour at impact. Let's look at the next image, please. Each rocket was the height of a 4-story building. And you can see a diagram of the V2 on the left, and you can see, if you look closely, you can see the height of a person barely reaches a tiny portion of the height of the V2. The warhead consisted of a ton of dynamite and other explosives. Big and heavy though it was, it could reach lightning speeds, and Allied radar could not track the missiles, so there was no warning. But could this turn the tide and win the war for Hitler? Not a chance. The efficacy of the V2 was limited because soon after its launch, it could no longer be guided, and thus it hit targets more or less at random. In the course of the war, 3,000 were fired, killing almost 7,000 civilians, mostly in London and the port of Antwerp. That's a tragedy, of course, 7,000 dead. But an infinitesimal number in a war that took the lives of 75 million people. More people died as slave laborers who built the test sites than did from the rocket blasts themselves. No Allied military installation was ever hit by a V2. Yet Hitler made this missile project the core of his military budget. The program cost $40 billion in today's money, twice what the Manhattan Project cost, which led to the atomic bomb that did end the war in the Pacific. The renowned physicist Freeman Dyson said that the V2s were the greatest gift to the Allies because the rockets absorbed so much of German resources. He likened it to unilateral disarmament. Okay, if you can scroll down, Millie. Here you see SS Major Werner von Braun. He's not in uniform here, but that was his rank, SS Major, and he had joined the Nazi Party as early as 1937. Later, he would be manager of America's NASA Space Initiative. Well, as you all know, he was also the director of the V2 program. His test site was Peenemünde, an island off the German coast in the Baltic Sea. It was destroyed by British bombers in August 1943, so he moved it to the remote town of Blizna in southeastern Poland, out of the range of Allied aircraft. Here, inmates of that Pushkow concentration camp that Berenshtein later liberated, well, they were the ones who built the facility under the direction of a barbaric SS general who had overseen the construction of Auschwitz. Berenshtein found the proving ground at Blizna and relayed its coordinates to the Red Army. But it was never bombed. The test site was soon abandoned by von Braun and his team, and the operation was moved to a dense forest hundreds of miles away. Even before that, Polish partisans managed to find an unexploded V2 rocket that had fallen near Blizna and deftly managed to disassemble it and smuggle its parts to Britain, where it was analyzed by intelligence experts. Okay, you can remove that. Thank you. Now, late in the war, Germany was rife with rumors that the Fuhrer had a Wunderwaffe, a wonder weapon, that would turn the tide. I think you can see that the V2 fell far short of that. Still, it is remarkable that Berenshtein and his comrades located the site. And his mission dramatically illustrates an aspect of the partisans less well known than blowing up trains, namely espionage for the Allies. They operated behind enemy lines for over 2 years. Now, in conclusion, what are we to make of the long, tumultuous life of Leonid Berenshtein? I'm struck most by how he exemplified Soviet patriotism at its best. There is more here even than selfless dedication to the cause of defeating fascism. Throughout the war, he demanded that his fighters respect one another and not harm innocent civilians. He rescued Jews and non-Jews and willingly undertook a highly dangerous spying mission, succeeding against all odds. And his intense experience in the Great Patriotic War molded him to such an extent that he felt bound to the Soviet motherland for nearly half a century. He was not honored as a hero of the Soviet Union. And as the film indicates, anti-Semitism was the reason. In the course of researching this talk, I learned that about 13,000 of those coveted medals were awarded, and only 100 went to Jews. I wish that accolade had been bestowed upon him and that his story had been better known in the Soviet Union, because he stands as a direct refutation of the image of the Jew that was spread by Kremlin propaganda. That is, weak and cowardly, greedy and corrupt, disloyal and divisive. Berenshtein was the opposite of every one of those stereotypes. But they were so ingrained that his country could not properly recognize a true hero in its midst. Yet we can, thanks to this film. Thank you.